to actually be here for this session, and if it's even gonna tell us if other people show up. But I do think that some of our the other prize committee people might show. But I'll just go ahead and dive in since we're all here. So the Howard F. Cline Book Prize in Mexican History is presented at each LASA International Congress to the author of an outstanding book of major importance to the development of the field of Mexican history, published in either English or Spanish. The books are judged on the quality of the research, analysis, and writing, and the significance of their contribution to the history of Mexico. So before I talk about the books and the panelists for today, I want to thank the other two members of the prize committee, Paulo Lopez Caballero and Steve Lewis. It was really a pleasure to serve with these two. We had a wonderful pile of books to read, and the chance to talk about those books with these two colleagues who are just super smart and really engaged and thoughtful was, I learned a ton more from those conversations about how to position these historiographically and to think about them conceptually. It was really, really a treat. Oh, this is probably Stephen logging in as me, but that's okay. Well, you'll recognize that he looks different from me. We awarded this year's Cline Prize to Corinna Zeltsman for her book, Inking of the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th Century Mexico, published by the University of California Press. Obviously, both of these in 2021. I will we'll have presentations of both of these books. So the citations here will be brief, but Zeltsman's book is carefully crafted and beautifully written, weaving together cultural and political history to offer a narrative thread to follow through all the twists and turns of the long 19th century, from the Bourbon reforms to the Mexican Revolution. Zeltsman demonstrates how understanding the materiality of printing as a social, legal, and labor relationship, rather than as the abstraction of print culture, offers a surprising history of 19th century state formation. The committee members all agreed that we look forward, among other things, to teaching this wonderful book in our classes. It really, teaching the 19th century, as you all know, is a bear. This really will help you. We also awarded a strong honorable mention to Paul Gillingham for his prodigiously researched book, Unrevolutionary Mexico, The Birth of a Strange Dictatorship, published by Yale University Press. Focusing on the states of Veracruz and Guerrero during the decade he dubs the long Aleman period from 1945 to 1955. Before, that's sort of the first part, and then he opens out to a Mexico-wide study, uses those case studies to think about the whole country. Gillingham takes up the question that has anchored the historiography of post-revolutionary Mexico: why the authoritarian one-party regime proved to be so durable. He offers an answer by examining networks of personal and patronage relationships, some fancy footwork with elections, and strategic use of repression and violence. Infrastructural development and an explosion of mass media distracted from widespread corruption, and careful handling of a restless military forestalled brewing political upheaval. The committee all agreed, I think that you all will agree as well, anybody who is interested in 20th century Mexico, particularly Mexican political history, will have to read this book. It's a definite must read. I am thrilled that today two wonderful colleagues have agreed to offer their own appreciations of these two prize-winning books and give their presentations. I'm going to introduce all four panelists, and then I was thinking we would start with Sarah and Paul, and then Pamela and Corinna, if that's okay with all of you. So just to give all the introductions, this is kind of odd because I think you all know each other, but I'm going to do this anyway because here we are, and it's LASA. Paul Gillingham is a professor of history in Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University. In addition, Paul has a very long CV, and I can't go through the whole thing, but in addition to Unrevolutionary Mexico, he has co-edited two important anthologies: Journalism, Satire, and Censorship in Mexico, published by University of New Mexico Press in 2018, and Dicta Blanda, Politics, Work, and Culture in Mexico from 1938 to 1968, published by Duke University Press in 2014. His first monograph, Cuauhtemoc Bones, Forging National Identity in Modern Mexico, which I have to say, I keep returning to this book over and over again, was published by also University of New Mexico Press in 2011 and won the CLAW Mexican History Book Prize, as well as honorable mention for LASA's Mexico section for the best book in social sciences. I think that Corinna and Paul have some like tag teamed some prizes on like LASA and social sciences. And anyway, Paul's books and many, many journal articles have gained wide recognition, not only for their rigorous research and historiographical engagements, but also for their lively writing and wry sense of humor. I think all of us agree that his work is just really fun to read. So I recommend it, also really lovely to teach with. Corinna Zeltsman is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University, and soon will take up a position as assistant professor of history at Princeton University. In addition to ink on the Fingernails, she is author of Defining Responsibility, Printers, Politics, and the Law in Early Republic in Mexico City, published by the Hispanic American Historical Review in 2018. Also, her dissertation won like all the prizes, which was very cool to see. Pamela Vogel, an old friend who like protested with me outside the US Embassy in a Zapatista getup many years ago, is associate professor of history at Dartmouth University, as well as a co-founder of both Freedom University, Georgia, and the Tepoztlan Institute for Transnational History of the Americas. She is the author of Alone Before God, The Religious Origins of Modernity in Mexico from Duke University Press in 2002, as well as many journal articles, my favorite of which may still be Peeing on the Palace, Bodily Resistance to Bourbon Reforms in Mexico City from the Journal of Historical Sociology in 1992. I still teach that. It teaches very well. Sarah Austin joins us from another, she's like double conferencing, joining us from another conference, is associate professor of history at the University of Vermont and the author of The Mexican Revolution's Wake, The Making of a Political System from Cambridge University Press in 2018, and several articles, including the prize-winning article, Out of the Shadows, Violence and State Consolidation of Post-Revolutionary Mexico, 1927 and 1940, which appeared in Latin Americanist in June 2020, when some of you may have been distracted, but it's worth going back and looking at that. So Sarah, I'm going to start by turning it over to you to give your presentación of Paul's book.
Great, thank you so much. And congratulations to both of our authors. So basically, I'm just going to gush for 10 minutes about how much I loved this book.
That's your job.
It's going to be kind of historiographical gushing. So if it sounds very like intellectual, please understand that it's still gushing, because I absolutely loved this book and I learned so much from it, and it is my absolute pleasure to get to be the one to present it. Paul and I have a lot of shared research interests. We've sort of focused on different periods and different regions, but I just learned so much from this book. It was really a revelation to me in a lot of ways. It's a book that really enhanced my understanding of things that I thought I already understood pretty well. And also really forced me to question a lot of my own long-held beliefs and assumptions about the practice of politics in Mexico in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I would say that one of the many reasons, maybe the most important reason that this book is so important within the historiography of 20th century Mexico and why everyone should read it, is that in histories of Mexico and in our historiography, it's always there, it's always important, and yet it is almost never the object of analysis, which has always sort of perplexed me as a historian of Mexico. But part of the reason is that it's really, really hard to analyze the PRE. So in the historiography, we see the results of the PRE's actions, we see its interactions, but we often treat it as a sort of black box that we can't see inside. So Mexico's historical experience of PreHegemony is very well known, but the processes by which it was achieved are hardly known to us at all. And Gillingham's extensive work to explain these processes during a brief but highly significant period in the party's formation in the mid-1940s to early 1950s is, without exaggeration, a real gift to our field. This book gives us the how and why for outcomes we have long recognized, but not fully understood in practice previously. So the most important findings of this book concern elections, violence, and demilitarization, and this is based on close examination of two states, Guerrero and Veracruz. Elections, violence, and demilitarization are all things that we tend to think of as making Mexico different than the rest of Latin America in the mid-20th century. And this work forces us to question a lot of the long-held assumptions we have about all of these things. And this book is also largely focused on a relatively short period, so really mostly 1945 to 1950, with a little bit before and a little bit after that. And Gillingham argues that this was a watershed period for Mexico's political development for numerous reasons. And I would say this constitutes a pretty important revision of more typical periodizations, as he insists on 1945 to 1950 as the most decisively important years in shaping Mexico's politics for the years that followed. I would also argue that this is a probably overdue and much needed historiographical decentering of Cardenismo. I know that's just, I've just committed all sorts of crimes as a historian of Mexico. So a decentering of Cardenismo in favor of scrutinizing its legacies. And this includes some surprising conclusions about the enduring role of Cardenas himself. And Gillingham makes a very convincing and well-supported case for 1945 as a previously little understood turning point in Mexican politics, and particularly in terms of the ruling party's ability to exert its will at the state and local levels. Rather than a revolution that gradually institutionalized, which is certainly the PRI's history of itself, and one that I think we have accepted overwhelmingly in the historiography, Gillingham shows us a revolution in rapid retreat and sometimes active defeat by the mid-1940s. And this was as elite and conservative forces availed themselves of many of the institutional mechanisms at their disposal, but also some extra legal and often violent ones to undo a brief period of political and economic reivindication of working people. And this was particularly of agraristas. And he cautions us that even as the PRI became nationally powerful, conciliation and compromise at the grassroots were still necessary. And this was especially true at the state and local levels. So electoral monopoly was often partially the result of fixed elections, but also of violence, intimidation, and low popular turnout, and the systematic disempowerment of independent organized labor. So rather than winning hearts and minds, the early PRI succeeded in part because many citizens gave up on voting entirely. But Gillingham also emphasizes that even at the peak of PreHegemony, in many places there were, and I quote, jostling angry crowds beneath a soft authoritarian surface, unquote, to which the party was always to some degree answerable. And I think this is such a critical point for understanding the party's entire history. This was particularly true at the local level, where municipal elections, as it turns out, were usually too much trouble for the state to either control or overturn, and sometimes remained genuinely contested as a result. So he cautions us that engineered elections did not produce political hegemony, and this is a point perhaps rather too frequently ignored by most of us in our descriptions of the PRI's habits and outcomes in both our research and our teaching. He shows us that stolen elections did not create consensus, even when they artificially advertised it, and that conciliation and compromise were still necessary to make politics work at the state level. So the sort of Black legend of the irrelevance of elections in Mexico really bears revisiting. Electoral competition continued, he shows us, but by the mid-1940s, it was carried out, and sometimes quite fiercely, within the PRI via primaries that reflected an ongoing post-revolutionary tradition of popular mobilization until 1950, so sort of bookending this period when the primaries were abolished. And I would say that this is a much needed reminder that scholars of the post-revolutionary period ignore the significance of elections, and maybe especially of campaigns, even when they were clearly rigged at their own peril and at the expense of our understanding of political processes in those years. Another critical insight he gives us in this book is about how informal power came to be an essential ingredient of politics in the early career of the PRI. And there's so much detail about this, I can't possibly do it justice. But he shows us that even as local politicians conspicuously struggled to implement programs, political leaders of the era, and none more than Miguel Alemán himself, grew more powerful and achieved political control at the state and local levels in practice through a variety of mechanisms, including selective violence. At the same time, he shows us that lots of people got rich doing this. There were considerable financial opportunities and other valuable perks for those that were willing to cooperate with the PRI, and sometimes that was at the significant cost of their previously fiercely defended principles. So this was, unsurprisingly, a political atmosphere in which bureaucrats and business people flourished, and this won't be a surprising conclusion for most people who read this book, but the detailed explanations of how and why this came to be are incredibly fascinating and enlightening. Gillingham also gives us a really nuanced picture of the highly particular nature of Mexican post-revolutionary authoritarianism and its diverse practices. And this includes his interpretation of why Mexico did not succumb to military authoritarianism. And of course, this is really the main pillar sustaining arguments about Mexican exceptionalism within Latin America in this period. He significantly complicates this story, and he argues that while Mexico's military was relatively small, its various functions remained critically important. Its members remained legally and often politically protected when they defied the law and even the Constitution. And that, again, some of them became both powerful and extremely wealthy in the process. So this was a less complete and a much more fraught demilitarization than we typically recognize. He also shows us, and this is something that I think hasn't been widely recognized at all, that the army was a really important tool of social control in this period, above all, and a real and constant threat to dissidents in general, and especially in rural areas. So effectively, if unconstitutionally, the military was used for all kinds of policing, some more legal, some more legitimate than others, and that included the policing of elections. So the reality on the ground, he shows, made the depoliticization of the military exceedingly difficult, if not outright impossible, and this was especially true in the provinces. He also shows us that the military became a fact of daily life for many Mexicans in this period, because despite the army's small size, he shows us that 1 in 5 municipios had soldiers stationed there. So in the end, civilian governance was confirmed for a series of interesting reasons, again, that I don't have time to do any justice to, and at significant costs, and above all, the state giving the army a lot of autonomy moving forward. Gillingham does all of this grounded in the study of 2 states, thanks to an absolutely stunningly impressive body of archival and secondary research, and frequently drawing on supporting evidence from all over the country. His engagement with both primary and secondary sources is both deep and masterful. Mexican history, as we all know, has long been regionalized, but he makes abundantly clear the national stakes of regional studies. And indeed, some of his most important arguments concern the relationships between Mexico City and the provinces all the way down to the local level. I want to emphasize how difficult this is to both establish context, but then also to tease meaning out of really convoluted, complicated local conflicts. When you are studying something like that in an archive, it is very, very difficult to understand the significance. And he does this throughout the entire work, which is really a remarkable achievement of both research and interpretation. It takes so much expertise and so much patience to do it, and he does it repeatedly. I should say he also makes some absolutely fascinating comparisons with other countries, and the most stunning of these, and I won't spoil it for you because you really need to read it yourself, is his comparison of levels of violence in Mexico and Colombia in these same years during La Violencia in Colombia. So in closing, whether Mexico in those years was unrevolutionary or post-revolutionary, I would say that this is not a book about a dictatorship exactly, but something much more complicated and also much more interesting, if also impossible to succinctly define, as Gillingham readily acknowledges. This book is beautifully written. It is argued very compellingly. My experience was you cannot skip a single page or you will miss something genuinely important. This is a work that will be vitally important for graduate students and scholars of Mexico, and I would argue also 20th century authoritarianism for the foreseeable future, and you should all read it.
Paul, did you want to say anything before?
Well, actually, I've got a lengthy series of prepared remarks inspired by Gwyneth Paltrow's moving Oscar acceptance speech about the same time as you were protesting with Pamela outside the US Embassy. And it went on for about 10 minutes. She broke into tears several times. And I think ended up thanking her goldfish. So yeah, I'd like to thank my goldfish. But in between that and the goldfish, I'm starting here. I'm really grateful, that a committee like this read my work and liked it. And I'm really glad that Sarah, who I know has an interesting and packed schedule, could actually talk about it, because not only do I find her work fascinating, but it is sort of, in many ways, the prehistory of the pre, and this really thick description, carefully thought out, times in the encomium I thought, hold on. That's surely what she said about herself in talks, because that is the way it is. So thank you very much for showing up. And then Corinna, read your book recently and thought it was fantastic. I wanted to ask all sorts of questions, but they were sort of nitpicking, unimportant questions like, does it make your brain bigger if you say you're busily setting type backwards all day? Because I had to do that at school. We used to have an old linotype press. And I remember thinking, this is going to leave me with a throbbing pain. So I wonder whether there's any neurology which says, if you set type backwards all day and are barely literate, you end up with an extraordinary sort of associative ability. None of this is about my book, but then you've all read my book more recently than I have, and I thank you for that. And so now I look forward to a chat. Nice to see you all, and look forward very much to hearing about Corinna's book.
Wonderful. I should have said, by the way, when I introduced Corinna, that she is also herself the granddaughter of 2 letter press printers, is that right? And an amateur letter press printer herself. So I think the materiality that you get from her book is legit. Okay, Pamela, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much, Julie. I want to start by thanking Julie and Vanessa Chavez for organizing this gathering and say that it is a real honor to participate in the celebration of Corinna Zeltsman's carefully crafted, smartly researched, and beautifully written and path-marking book, Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th Century Mexico. I want to start with a shout out to the blurring of the lines between manual and intellectual labor that the print workers that we meet in these pages rightly insisted on. Corinna's voluminous source base includes the following: government and church communications, press laws, judicial opinions, state contracts and records from the government printing shop, notarial documents, and private records from a major book-selling family. Any one of these sources could have been the basis for a terrific book. Together, the result is a sort of tour de force. We don't have to remind people that archival research in this period has a number of challenges, and Corinna really puts on a kind of clinic in how to do this. And the creativity of the sources too was a constant source of like surprise and joy when I was reading the book. But of course, it is of course the questions that she asks of this voluminous source base that make Ink Under the Fingernails such a tour de force. All of these sources in the book provide the context for a series of case studies that examine the politics of printing as they unfolded on the ground over the course of the long 19th century. These episodes underscore key features of 19th century printing politics, but also, and I think profoundly, demonstrate changing notions of press freedom and other notions of core freedoms and what freedom even is in the 19th century for different groups. One of the more intriguing themes running through the book is the question of corporate or individual responsibility for the production and content of text and the related notions of press freedom and notions of freedom more generally. These ideas divide along liberal and conservative lines post-independence, of course, but the interesting thing that she brings is the role of print workers, the intriguing role that print workers play in political outcomes. She places print shop workers at the heart of these larger questions of responsibility and freedom. As she notes, and I'm going to quote a lot from Corinna because her prose is so lovely, I just want you to hear it. Distinct from romantic notions of authorship as grounded in individual genius, printers stress the collaborative process of intellectual production by highlighting the behind-the-scenes processes of composition, correction, and designing. Now, as Jolie pointed out, a signal strength of the book is that she demonstrates change over time in notions of press and larger freedoms during a rather unorthodox time span, the late Bourbon reforms to the Mexican Revolution. And she opens, and I think rightly so, with the state of printing in the late 18th century. And I'm going to describe a little bit of what goes on in this first chapter because it's such a, I think, an interesting and innovative approach to the long 19th century. And we see the wisdom of this temporal choice in this opening chapter. As she explains, in the late 18th century, the editor Manuel Antonio Valdez held a privileged monopoly of the political news that he published in the Gaceta de Mexico in Mexico City. When the Crown challenged this monopoly that Valdez had, we hear in Corinna's telling Bourbon proto-liberalism loud and clear. Crown officials noted that there was no evidence of Valdez's own authorial contributions to the Gaceta. He merely reprinted news from the Gaceta de Madrid. Charles III's enlightened administration in this dispute between Valdez and the state underscored the privileges of authors and their heirs over institutions or corporations, and Valdez was not an author. He was simply a printer, an imitator, a reproducer of text. And Mexico City's enlightened Crown officials decided the problem could be fixed by limiting monopolies and cartels in order to stimulate printing. So Valdez did what print workers would do throughout the 19th century. He claimed copying, collecting, organizing, and publishing as part of authorship. Enlightened Crown officials, on the other hand, these Bourbon reformers, saw individual original textual creation, but also the need for state patronage and support. And then continuing on with her sort of stress of the materiality and centrality of printing and printers to political outcomes, she notes that the role that printing technology played in the violent political struggles of the independence era. She notes that printers were fully entangled in the broader struggles over the foundations of authority and the definitions of freedoms and rights in the age of revolution by pointing out things like that the rebels under Jose Maria Morelos had to rely on 2 small portable printing presses that they spirited out of urban areas and into rural headquarters, and noting that royalist printers and royalist partisans reached past pulpits, the traditional way of sort of getting the printed word out, to disseminate pocket works to individuals. And here we see in Corinna's work, as we do throughout the series of larger themes, in this case, the church sort of fading as the principal sort of ideological state apparatus during that period. And as she later explains, in 1820, the novelist, pamphleteer, and newspaperman Fernandez de Lizarde and others who seized upon the return of press freedoms imagined that public sales, the market, the free market, would, quote, liberate writers from the constraints of patronage, and writers in turn would elevate the public. In this early period of relative press freedoms, however, printers could earn more printing government proclamations with the license. Interestingly, the idea that public sales, a profit-driven market, would facilitate press freedoms, as she notes, ran up against notions that profit-seeking was money-grubbing and thus a sort of vile passion. So here we see her entering into a number of historiographical conversations that go beyond just the issue of print and printing. Here seeing real differences from the economically aggrandizing families of the late 18th century analyzed by Patricia Seed 30 years ago. And Corinna's telling the elevation of Homo economicus and market freedoms to the height of rationality was far from a shared sentiment in early 19th century post-independence Mexico. For later decades, Corinna calls our attention to the fact that being legally permitted to publish did not guarantee that one would be able to do so. And we see the agency of print workers to outcomes. The powers of printers could overrun authors' access to publishing, even when they had the financial resources to pay for the printing. So in other words, authors and printers conceptualize their rights in competing terms. There are too many contributions to historiographical conversations here to mention, even if we just confine ourselves to just the opening chapters. In a discussion of the press during the late Bourbon era, Corinna's proto-liberal enlightened Bourbon state offers a contrast to Bianca Primo's more subaltern-driven enlightenment that Primo saw sweeping the empire in her magisterial enlightenment on trial. Corinna dubs this era court-sponsored enlightenment and demonstrates quite persuasively that the Bourbon state, like later liberals, was operating with the notion of freedom centered on freeing individuals to pursue their market interests. But interestingly, as a labor historian and someone attuned to the kind of materiality of work, she sees the Enlightenment's dark underside as these notions of individualism denied workers the protection of corporate identities. Okay, so I briefly underscore these contributions to historiographical conversations because this book on printing and printers contributes so substantially to so many scholarly conversations that really it's a must read for pretty much anybody working in the long 18th or 19th century. But what makes Ink Under the Fingernails, I think, such a critical work, in addition to these contributions to so many varied historiographical conversations, is that the book, to quote her consistently lovely prose, opens a window onto the cultural, imaginary, and intellectual world of an elite sector of Mexico's artisanal and working communities. Printers imagined intellectual production as a composite, collaborative activity, not the paradigm of romantic individualism, a common theme among journalists. Ordinary print workers, again to quote her, question top-down efforts to sideline them from the public sphere for possessing insufficient cultural capital and for their association with gritty work. The printing shop embraced enlightened ideas about the relationship between manual and intellectual labor and the explorations of the creative aspects of work itself. While their arguments, she continues, on their behind-the-scenes labor push to democratize the lettered city, they simultaneously reinforce social hierarchies associated with literacy and print. They depended on the distinction between literacy and other modes of expression to distinguish themselves from other working groups. But they also undermine hierarchies by blurring boundaries between manual and intellectual labor and proving that social mobility was possible via literacy, even without formal education and cultural capital and powerful patrons. So I think that the contributions to the historiography, their contributions to the historiography of the Bourbon reforms, to our understanding of liberal and conservative differences in the immediate post-independence period, a very understudied period, and the contributions continue on to, you know, the early parts of the Porfiriato, as well all the way to the 1917 Constitution, where we see these definitions of press freedom be very imbricated with the notions of authorship as something collective that we see developing throughout and being contested throughout the long 19th century. So I want to end by saying that this is just an extraordinary book. The range of sources, the analysis, the contribution to multiple historiographical conversations, the craftsmanship, even on the cover, there's this little spot of ink. You can see the ink on the cover, but there's a little spot that actually looks like it's real ink, and I thought my pen had exploded onto the cover. So she manages to capture something that I think a lot of people overlook, which is that materiality.
So Corinna, I don't know if you wanted to say anything as well? Your Paltrow speech or whatever?
Yeah, my Oscar notes. No, thank you, Pamela. That was such a lovely read. And the shout out also goes to the book designer, who is a book artist. It didn't surprise me when I saw her, her day job is designing covers for UC Press, but by all the other hours, she does, book arts and work that's very much kind of about altering texts and, altered books. And so I was not at all surprised that she nailed the sort of ethos of the project with her cover design. Yeah, and I'm so grateful to the committee for reading the work, and really honored to receive your plaudits. I just have to thank all the people who helped make this possible. Some of whom are in this room.
And the Academy, of course. You have to thank the Academy.
Yeah, it was so much fun to work on the project. So I'm just grateful and gratified that it resonated with other folks.
So we have a few participants who are, I am going to defer to the LASA, to Vanessa and Hania about whether we can take questions either from Facebook or from the people in the room. And while they're answering that question, which I don't know the answer to, if it's possible on a webinar to do that. Am I allowed to ask questions? I have a question actually for Paul, which is, I would love to hear you talk more about I totally agree that I think that Sarah's work is a perfect kind of prequel to what you're doing. What you would, where you're telling students to go next in terms of what the next, if people want to get into that, like, because I think as understudied as the period that you're talking about is that kind of mid 50s up until 68, which everybody, I don't know, I just would be curious if you have thoughts about that, because it's such a tour de force of a book.
I've never been asked for a prescription before. I love it. So you should all go somewhere else and study something which is completely and utterly unrelated, but in more serious terms, you've got the sort of moving wall, which I was very lucky because it sort of lurched when I was just interested in this period. When I started, they just classified the presidential archives up until sort of the late 50s. There'd been this, I say, sudden lurch into a greater availability, and with it went Information, and then of course critically with it went the security services. So as always, it's kind of a function of what you've got, but then you can also make your own luck in finding things which other people haven't. Thematically, I think that LASA really nailed it in looking at environmental change as a driver of human society. I think most people I know are suffering from existential doom about the world melting around us all too literally. And I think you can see in the projects coming through the classic path of people taking our own contemporary concerns and projecting them backwards. I think that's a great thing. And so I would like to see, for example, somebody do a cultural history of what you might call popular ecology, which is people stringing together at the very basic level in village correspondence, their sort of causal relationships between politics and environment. And so you come across letters saying the local cacique, backed by the local zone commander, has chopped down all the trees, and we know that it's going to cause drought. And there's a lot of this sort of popular ecology. I look forward to seeing people do that. But I think they already are. I think the great thing, one of the many great things about graduate students is there's several steps, hopefully, ahead of us. By this stage of the game, which is one of the things which makes them so interesting to actually hang around with and speak to. So I think thematically, that's absolutely key. I think in terms of timing, the idea which I think Eric Zolov started pushing at an early stage of let's try and get over 1968 is one which you can still take further. I want to read a really well-argued revisionist account of Echeverria, which would pretend that Tlatelolco never happened and try and go back. So, okay, so what does Echeverria look like if I am, say, on an Isla Ejido somewhere in the south of Coahuila, let's say? I would really be interested. There's also the sort of the moving wall, but the closing window of there are people out there you can talk to. And if I'd done actually polished thank you as opposed to making it up over a cup of tea, I would have liked to thank anybody who ever actually bothered to talk to me, ranging from you on a beach over a beer, well, several, which was lovely, through to
we should do that again.
Unfortunately, I'm not in Wilmington anymore, but there is a beach here. So yeah,
there are other beaches to be had.
There are beaches to be had.
And other beers to be had.
You know, the people we're lucky enough to talk to, from archives to villages, etc. There's this window for looking at Echeverria and even the end of the 60s at a really fine-grained level by talking to people, which is going to close relatively soon. I'd like to see people exploring that.
Yeah.
And that aside, popular ecologists, people looking at nationwide the 70s, and I think there is a lot of work to be done on sort of south to south geopolitics. Something else, LASA is clearly run by either a bunch of clairvoyants or else people who move in a school with me and 1,500 other people. But I really like Christy Thornton's interest in exploring south to south and key questions like why Mexico never makes it into the non-aligned movement. I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I know that unfortunately, Relaciones Exteriores is Weberian enough to apparently weed their own stuff. So it's beautifully organized, but there's, according to people who've worked recently, not actually all that much there.
Right.
These are all things I want to know more about, but I'm sure that that's a really good question actually across the panel. What would you like to know more about?
By the way, I think that also on the South-South, I think Jessica Stites Moore's new book coming out on South-South human rights, looks, I haven't had a chance to get it yet, but that looks fantastic as well. So Corinna, to you then, what if you're gonna have all these grad students now, like what do you see as like the next, I know where your work is going, but where you would steer students to go, like based on like threads you saw that you would think would be interesting for other scholars to pull at?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul's point about environmental history is right on. And for the 19th century, there's some exciting work coming out. You know, Germán Vergara's new book about coal, you know, the creation of you know, the shift to that carbon-based, right, economies. And but also just, you know, thinking 19th century, I think there's so many directions to be explored. And I hope that more people will actually just dive into the 19th century as a period where, you know, the thing that I sort of discovered in my own research is that all the stuff that we talk about kind of happening in the 20th century is happening, you know, the discussions are all being set in the 19th century, right? But it's sort of like a black box in some ways in terms of historiography. I think one of the things I struggled with was even hanging on to a grand narrative when I was writing the book, like what, you know, how, even where to sort of claw onto or write into that can take account for, you know, a broader sort of sweep of time. But I think, I also think that it would be interesting to pursue, and I'm thinking more kind of methodologically than topically here, but pursuing studies that decenter, as much as I did this in my own work, sort of state formation lens, that decenter the state a little bit more for the 19th century period, and think about other lenses. Like I think that the idea of the sort of popular ecology is a really interesting one. How, you know, and I think a lot of the work that, you know, the fundamental questions about how people are making a living, you know, returning to sort of land, or some of the classic kind of questions that we've always thought about, but with sort of more of an eye for environmental concerns, would be really interesting to look forward to too. but I think it's kind of a wide open, area for research in so many different ways. And there is, in terms of like intellectual history, there have been a lot of really interesting people thinking transnationally about the 19th century and trying to put nation building in a broader kind of hemispheric or globally minded context. And there's a lot of really interesting graduate, student work happening in that vein as well, which I'm excited to read when it's coming out.
Yeah. So the questions can be put in the Q&A function. I don't know how we would get questions off of Facebook unless they have a way of like conveying those. I know there's someone from LASA who's monitoring Facebook, so I guess also put those in the chat. But I don't know. Also, Sarah or Pamela, if you or Steve, again, very fabulous. I'm sorry that Paolo couldn't make it, but I can't tell you what a joy it was to have these conversations with Steve and Paolo. It was really great. So I don't know if any of you have questions or comments for anything. I don't know. Wide open. Or from the audience here, if you want to put anything in the Q&A. I don't think we can put you on camera, but
I wanted to ask Corinna what you might be thinking about working on next.
I'm trying to bring together some of my interests in the materiality. I don't quite consider myself a book historian, but I'm interested in, thinking about the materiality of text and how ideas sort of move in these materially grounded ways. And as I was doing my research, I would sometimes get asked like, well, where does the paper come from? So that sort of led me to like my next project, which I think is going to be a sort of 19th and 20th century history of paper in Mexico, which thinks about how people made paper when we always sort of shorthand kind of early modern empire as sort of paper bureaucracy, right? And then when independence happens and all of those networks collapse, where do you get the paper from, right? So it involves kind of interest in how Mexicans are trying to make paper using, at a moment in the kind of global history of paper when there's like a crisis of how to make it because there's not enough rags in the world to account for growing uses of paper in everyday life. And so there are these sort of searches for alternative materials, which in Mexico take on particular valences related to the natural fibers that are available here. There's debates about political economy, whether it's better to import or to produce. There are questions about legality, like do we continue the sort of paper uses established by the Spanish Empire, or do we make new uses for how people can interface with the state using paper? So it's a kind of multidimensional, I call it a political, material, and environmental history of paper, because then by the 20th century, you make paper with trees, and that involves a whole different set of processes, communities and toxicity in making it. So that's sort of where I'm thinking of going. So if you have sources related to it, send them my way.
Would you think of going back to the 17th and 18th century?
Well, so the big question that's also so interesting about Mexico is that if I'm not positioning myself as a global paper historian, but there's this sort of master narrative about paper and political modernity that assumes it sort of moves from China to Europe to the Americas on this sort of march of technological progress. But of course, Mexico has this deep indigenous papermaking tradition of its own. And so it's interesting, which continues as a thread, even as, European paper is getting adopted and adapted. So, I'm open. I think I would begin the project with like a deep history chapter, right? That kind of tries to think through if we put Mexico at the center of a story of paper, what does that do for these kind of global master narratives about this material?
I was shocked to find out that to actually, at least in the 17th century, to get a court decision finalized, you had this very limited stock of approved paper. It's sort of bureaucracy gone mad on steroids. And there was quite often a shortage of it. And if you didn't have the king's paper, you couldn't actually hand down a binding judgment. And apparently the perfidious English regularly nicked stocks going across. And so I came across this case from the 1669, where it was really gripping. And I was thinking, I must know the end of this. And it had a really controversial detective story type ending, which I won't bore you with. The point of the story is that the last bit in the file says, I'm really sorry I can't make this binding because we don't have any of the right paper.
No papel sellado. That's,
This is
yeah.
amazing. Or is this
Yeah.
just a wonderful excuse to not actually have to decide something? But
That's
it
so,
makes
yeah,
me
that's
think that a sort of long-time history of paper
yeah. Well, I
could go in so
also
many directions.
I came across a similar document doing research for this book where someone had found a matter so pressing and of importance that they had to write a note to the viceroy on not approved paper. And it was about independence and the dangers of the Creoles. You know, they're like plotting right now, we need to do something. And the first thing that the officials are like incensed about is the fact that it's not on papel sellado, right? I'm like, this is a matter of national, imperial security, and the paper is like, they basically reprimand the guy and say put this on the right paper.
This is how empires end.
Right. The shortages. I mean, the fact that we think in our contemporary world about paper as just abundance and cheap, and maybe we need to rethink that paradigm in light of chronic shortage, and the way that works politically, right? That's I want to read that case if you remember it.
I'd love to ask, actually, Paul and Sarah, since you're here, because you've both been involved also in kind of archival projects, right? A little bit of sort of archival recovery projects, or trying to create, I know a little bit more about what Paul's been up to, but Sarah, this is just from e-stalking you and what I saw that intrigued me from your CV. I'd be interested to hear, since we're talking about sources, a little bit more about those projects and also I think a lot of us are fussing over the challenges of doing research in Mexico right now, of even just getting into the AGN, much less, even with COVID lifting, it seems like it's stayed pretty hard. So that's a separate question, but I just would love to hear each of you talk more about these kind of archival, it's not really recovery, it's more like archival construction. Tell us.
Are you talking about the stuff I did with the Vidal papers at the AGN?
But I thought you did I saw something in your CV, and now I don't have it in front of me, that you were doing a kind of, and I know that Paul has been doing something trying to get a lot of the various vanishing archives made available again. But any of that kind of stuff of like how you're trying to make archival materials available. Or Pam, is that a hand up?
Yeah, if there's no one else, it's kind of.
Yeah.
Sarah, you first.
Oh, well, so the biggest project that I did with that was I just, through pure dumb luck, when I was doing my dissertation research, found out that one of the main figures in my dissertation had his personal papers at the AGN that had never been cataloged.
Wow.
And this was just like, I don't know if all of you know Marta Loyo at UNAM.
Mm-hmm.
She happened to be the only one who knew about this collection because she had been the person responsible for managing the donation from the family. And so I was telling her about my project, and she said, "Oh, well, have you looked at his papers?" And I said, "He has papers?" And of course, the AGN, they had this stuff in storage. Luckily, it was not in deep storage offsite. And I had to make a deal with them that I basically negotiated, and I said, if you let me look at this uncatalogued stuff, I'll tell you what's in the boxes, and did an inventory of it. But there was a project that unfortunately didn't come to fruition, where we were going to try to digitalize the whole collection to make it available for local scholars in Chiapas who can't necessarily go to the AGN, because this was the socialist governor of Chiapas. And it was really useful for my purposes in studying him and Southeastern socialism for my first book. But really, it's just this incredible and unmatched wealth of documents for local history in Chiapas. And that's a place where there were some archive fires in that period.
Mm-hmm.
And the archival record's been really disrupted for a lot of reasons. So it's at the AGN and it's cataloged now, but we were never able to complete the digitalization project.
Oh, bummer. Paul, did you want to say anything about what you've been up to?
Yeah, well, Jolie, as a board member,
I've been paying close attention for sure.
Yeah, it's
at least I know a little bit about it.
Exactly. So the problem came in 2016 when this source, which so many of us had used quite intensively, which were the intelligence archives, for all their problems, which we could go into at length, but we won't. But they were a treasure trove, and they were briefly available. And then in 2016, access started to be shut down through the sort of predictable. We're not really censoring, but that will be very difficult to get hold of sort of bureaucratic procedures you can imagine. And so there was a prospect that we were going back to sort of Russia, where you'd have a 3 or 4 year window of open KGB archives, massive excitement, and just as you started learning something, it gets shut down again. Well, luckily it's not the 1990s. An awful lot of people have been busily sort of archivally hoovering with cameras and scanners. And so a group of us in the Colegio de Mexico and around the States thought, if there's so much out there, you should be able to come up with a sort of crowdsourced archive of everything that people have got. And then we need to find a safe repository for it, and one which will guarantee its public access. So I think Sarah is really onto something in the extremely undemocratic nature of archive access. Which is not even necessarily that eased by digitization. But the difference between somebody who can afford to spend 6 months in Mexico City around the corner from the AGM and the rest of the world is obviously cataclysmic. Online archives offer some sort of a potential redress of that, as long as, of course, they're without a paywall, they're open source. And so there's an umbrella organization called the Center for Research Libraries, which is funded by all the R1s and which agreed to host it. And they've got a quite good platform and a sort of landing page. And so we got donations from kind people who sent the stuff in. We got a team of people to tag it. And now it's supposedly fully text searchable, about 15,000 documents on the CRL website. Its full name is MIDAS, the Mexican Intelligence Digital Archives. And I think my favorite story is we launched it officially on the 50th anniversary of Tlatelolco in the Colegio. And first of all, it looked until the day that the anniversary actually happened, it wasn't going to be up at all. And then when it was, I gave a demonstration and happily tapped Diaz Ordaz into the search box, and it popped up saying, no documents found. Yeah, but the technology has since then actually stopped hiccuping. So it's there. I think possibly even more important, it serves as inspiration for a Mexican project, Article 19, who have 300,000 documents from the Dirty War. And while I'm saying, well, we would really like to move away from Tlatelolco and the Dirty War, it is fundamental to know about it. And they have this huge trove and they're doing the same thing, tagging it, putting it up, it's open access. And so the benefits of clumsy censorship, right, Corinna?
I mean, this thing about, like, for example, I'm sorry, go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, I was going to say on that, following up on Paul's point about this kind of lack of democratic access to archives. Recently, we put together a group called the Patrona Collective, was named after the late Maria Elena Martinez, and took a group of mostly low-income, under-resourced graduate students over to Rome and provided them with, housing and tickets, plane tickets and things like that, as a way to sort of, democratize access to the Vatican's really rich resources for Latin America, which I think, and this is something that I really appreciated again about Corinna's book, that the 19th century has been overread as a period of secularization. And I think she did a really nice job in that discussion of the mystery of the Inquisition, this kind of book about it, as she explains, a book about a kind of seducer, a sort of voluptuous rake who tries to seduce an innocent girl. And this novel, this French novel from 1860, I believe Corinna can tell us, was serialized on the pages. Was it El Monitor Republicano, or was it, on the liberal Monitor Republicano, inciting this huge debate about, between the church and the state, which I thought she really captured the kind of, the religious passion, that continued to mark politics in Mexico, obviously during the Reforma, but both before and beyond the Reforma. And so one of the things that a number of books have come out of that Patrona Collective trip to Rome, where we basically divvied up all the archives in the city that we thought could be, have information relevant to Latin American topics, and had different people go to them each day and then come back and talk to us about what they had found. And I think I just kind of want to recommend it as a sort of process for lowering barriers to access, of kind of collectivizing resources from wealthy private institutions like Dartmouth and Princeton, in this case, in particular Notre Dame, and putting them at the hands of graduate students at places that have fewer resources. But we're not doing a digitalizing project. I agree with you, Paul. That's not always a democratizing project, but we are thinking of other ways to get people places for their research, in part to challenge the kind of, particularly places, church archives, ecclesiastical archives, that help people like who are sort of rewriting the 19th century as a time of great religious upheaval and passion. Yeah.
I have other questions about archives. We do have a question from our audience for Corinna. This isn't even from me, about gender and printing in Mexico and during that time period, and whether the question of gender stood out to you. I actually already know the answer to this one, but well, I'll let you guys.
No, I mean, I definitely, the ways in which printers sort of constructed their personas and constructed the printing shop as a sort of masculine space was something that stood out a lot in my research. And, towards the end of my research, I started thinking, like, I know there are women in every printing shop for sure, right? Like, what are, they're cleaning, they're running errands, they're the family members of the printers who are writing petitions when the printers get jailed, or taking over the business when the printers get exiled. But, the only place they appear in sources is in these constructs of the printers who have kind of access to, they can use the presses to publish poems, and they write newspaper articles in which they talk about, the only female character is the printing press, which is gendered as feminine in all of their lore, right? So she showed up, I kind of started collecting all of the ways in which the printing press is gendered. And as a wife, like a compañera in the struggle, or a nurturing spouse, as a daughter who's silent and listens to what the printer says to her. That's the 18th century iteration, like the early 19th century sort of obedient daughter of the shop. And then also, which becomes a metonym for power relations in the printing shop, because it's like the same as the workers are supposed to be like the press, silent and sort of obedient to the master of the printing shop. And then, by the late 19th century, the press is like, she can also be like the Virgin Mary, right? A sort of corporate protected, a saint of the corporate community, or as like the compañera who wore herself out in the struggle against tyranny, or as, an old grandmother who gives, advice to the younger men of the printing shop, So I did just write a really small piece about women in the printing shop, because there were all these small, traces of women printers who would show up in the archives, but most of the characters I was able to identify were men, but they talk about the press, right? That sort of part of how they construct the image of the printing shop as a male space through the lore and the sort of the corporate mythologies.
I thank you, Corinna. I wanted to, if we could just actually, and this takes up a question that comes up in Corinna's book as well, the question about sort of intellectual responsibility for printed material, and the question of archives, which is that on the one hand, there's, in terms of digitization, there's sort of Linda Arnold's famous, the hard drive. Who gets the hard drive of like Linda Arnold's vast collection of like,
I think this deserves a panel. I just want to say, yeah.
Exactly, like how many, particularly 19th century people have benefited from the largesse of Linda Arnold. But I guess also the question of like how we, there obviously are questions about taking archival material, essentially publishing it online. Mm. Paul, you've obviously found a way to like skirt those questions, because the absence, I mean, you're right about the Ministry of Foreign Relations. When I was doing the book on International Women's Year, what you would think would be the most like anodyne thing ever, and that they would just want to trumpet it, there are no documents in the Ministry of Foreign Relations on International Women's Year. There's like a couple of little like newspaper clippings files. Mm. And I actually sent in other people, because I thought, well, maybe they just don't want to give it to a gringa, or they don't want to, like, I sent in actual Mexicans to do like, to see if they could. And I had catalog numbers for them. The archivist had given me numbers and they would go in and no se encuentran every single time. So there's this problem of like how stuff gets like disappeared, you know, the like that aspect of it. But then if we can find this stuff, what are the limitations to making it public? There's also, I think, you know, like in terms of responsibility and whether the archives would seek redress for that if we're making public things that they have proprietary control over. And then there's next part of that, which is even more complicated to me, which is I suspect you have all found that our students believe that the only history that exists is whatever they can find through their laptops. And I do have some pretty intense concerns about what that means in terms of what students understand history to be, because obviously the voices that get amplified through digitization tend to fit a certain profile. And maybe we can try to rectify that. But these are kind of related questions, right? If we're not allowed to put out there all the stuff that we're finding, then what we're getting is the stuff that's being allowed to be digitized and published that way. I don't know if this set of questions makes sense, but the digitization of history, I've actually found a little bit troubling, and that I'm worried that it means that it will deepen that problem of researchers. And I think of it as undergraduates, but I think at this point it's also grad students, because these are now the grad students who grew up digital, right? And often don't go much past what they can find online. Which you really noticed during the pandemic, like if it was as if it wasn't digitized, it didn't exist. I don't know if that constellation of questions makes sense to people, but.
For me, the problem with the digital, well, there's two. One of your questions, which is about sort of the legalities and possession, etc.
Yeah.
That was really complicated and a lot in flux. But in the end, the basic things you need to know are that documents are public goods.
Mm-hmm.
They're not patrimonio nacional, they're public goods. And so there's no question of copyright on that. There's question of copyright on other people's images, photographs in it, but government documents, you can't get told they're copyrighted because constitutionally they can't be.
So would they ask us to like pay to be able to publish a document in a book? They actually shouldn't be able to do that?
Oh, it's not a good question. I have no idea.
Okay.
If it's an image, then they should be allegedly passing that on to whoever created the image. If it's the image of a piece of text and
right.
you took it, then no, I would say that's a total scam.
Interesting. I think we've all been charged that way though by the AGN. Anyway, okay.
The other one though, in terms of research, is very interesting. Because I completely agree. You get a digital highway. I'm horrified by people text searching massive troves with no context. I mean, we could rant on for hours like embittered
the kids these days
that we are. But the thing, I think there's two things which are lost with all the benefits to digitization. And one is the discrimination of knowing what not to note. When you're actually in an archive saying, well, sorry, this is rubbish, this is rubbish. So you can focus in on then trying to weave connections between the things which you judge on the spot count. And you can't from a hard drive of an entire archive sweep, nip next door and see what there is in a different branch of the AGN. And I think that's a huge loss. I think that digital actually ironically militates against the sort of archival wandering, which as long as it doesn't make you an endemic procrastinator, is actually really productive and fun. And if you got the digital superhighway, you just don't do it so much. Right. And so I think that's a loss, both intellectually and in terms of fun.
More importantly, in terms of fun. Anyway.
Yes. I think it takes away happy accidents, where you ask for one box because you want to look at a particular folder, and then it turns out actually the other folder that you didn't know you needed to look for had something much more interesting that you didn't know about, and it didn't occur to you to search for. So I think particularly thinking about accessibility and equitable access, as much as we can ever achieve that, I think the reality moving forward is that we have to find a balance for our students between both things, so that we can improve access through digitalization, but then also ideally find funding to send people to be in physical archives, because they need both effectively. And there's just so much missing from the research experience if you don't have the ability to see what's in the next folder or the next box.
Has anybody managed to get into the AGN lately? Yeah. Dang. Okay. I keep hearing that it's hard to get. I think I heard this from Corinna, but also from other students who are down there. It's very difficult to get an appointment, which is a bummer. Like now there's like this logistical, you can't get stuff from the AGN because you literally can't get in the door. Anyway, okay, yeah.
Are there other questions? I had another question for Corinna that I've been dying to ask. Where, with neoliberalism, I think there's been, the kind of ravages. I think there's been a kind of recasting of liberalism in the 19th century as the premier kind of liberatory force. And you talked a little bit about popular liberalism in some of the later chapters, and it was intriguing to me because so much of the literature on popular liberalism, Guardino, Mallon, Kaplan, Anino, others, really centers on rural areas, peasantries, things like that. And there seemed to be a tension there because so much of what you're saying about this corporate identification of these workers is sort of anathema to some of these individual market freedoms that, that hegemonic liberal groups in the 19th century are promoting. So are you in that group of, wow, we have to rethink maybe some of the conservative populism of a Carrera in Guatemala and things like that as maybe, as part of our rethinking the 19th century?
Well, I mean, I think that for, that the liberal, I see the liberalism working in these sort of discursive, like in action in my work a lot, right? So the way that it just gets kind of operationalized, these discourses for various political or kind of cultural, intellectual goals. And so, it's a useful tool for printers who want to be left alone. I mean, there's all sorts of kind of intellectual reconfigurations of the printer as a neutral conduit, as a machine, foregrounding sort of individual authorship as a sort of, so, it's interesting to see printers kind of constructing as kind of co-constructors of some of these ideas because it sort of suits their own pursuit of autonomy, right? Which autonomy in the sense of, in a sort of liberal sense of don't bother me all the time. And so, at the same time that kind of argumentation, by cutting themselves out of the regulatory scheme, they also diminish their own importance. And so there's a sort of ambivalence, right, about what ways is it, in what ways am I sort of undermining myself by making these kinds of arguments. So, it's interesting to just, I see it really working in these micro contexts, in some ways. And so I hesitate to sort of say like liberalism, as a system, for, a liberatory system, but it certainly is working in, as a way to chip away at kind of ideas that just, the disdaining of manual labor, right? And sort of the idea that work as elevating, but there's always an ambivalence about, well, do we really want to associate with work, or do we want to kind of leave this world behind and join the ranks of intellectual production? So I don't know, I have a hard time parsing it out, right? It becomes kind of part of the churn of the ambivalence of this period, right? A desire to have your cake and eat it too. I don't know.
I like that strategic discursive deployment of it while still maintaining a distance. I learned so much about popular liberalism reading this book. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else? I actually have another question for Paul and Sarah, actually, since you're, wait, let me make sure this isn't a new question. Okay. Since you're here and like, we have a little time, which is about what it means to try, I think maybe particularly in the current context. I was thinking about this, I was at my dissertation advisor's retirement conference, what is it now? Almost 2 weeks ago. And we were talking, I was talking with JT Wei, who works on Guatemala, gave a really wonderful paper about, I think probably something that a number of us have experienced, which is writing these serving as an expert witness in asylum cases. And what I have found to be a very troubling thing, and maybe it's because I get asked a lot to testify on cases that involve gender violence of some sort. And so what I'm asked to testify to is essentially Mexican toxic masculinity, that's a thing, and that like and it kind of insisting on that, and because it becomes the basis of an asylum claim. And if you don't do that, you're going to lose the case. Like you have to be willing to reinscribe a very troubling and often quite racist narrative in order to serve this one. Maybe this is also a problem of liberalism, right? In order to serve this one person that's applying, or maybe it's a family applying for asylum, right? So it's often a woman and her child, a woman and a sister. The facts of the case, as they're narrated, are gruesome and involve a kind of I don't know, juridical porn or something to them. It's pretty unsettling. So I guess I was curious, for the two of you, you write so effectively about violence, and whether you think about like, I don't know, if you have any thoughts about writing about it now. Has the current context made you, I don't know, approach it in certain ways? Also, if anyone here has thoughts about how to do these asylum cases without feeling like you have done some serious harm. I mean, I don't know. I truly don't know. And JT and I had a pretty intense conversation about it. I think he ends up doing a lot that are about violence around sexual and gender diversity as well. And he's looking at Guatemala. I'm also looking at cases mostly in Mexico. So I don't know. Just to put that out there, it's been one of the more troubling things of the current moment to me. And obviously I mean, not even just a post Ayotzinapa, I think, from all of the conversations about the nature of violence in Mexico, it makes it complicated about how we weigh in on those questions. So just that.
I find that I struggle with this, particularly in my teaching as well, because I do a lot of teaching about drugs and drug trafficking and drug violence and gang violence, in addition to the work that I've done on behalf of asylum seekers. And I think it's a really difficult balance to be very frank with students about what's happening in Mexico without sensationalizing the violence, without it sort of becoming narcos for credit. Because I teach a whole course about drug trafficking, and students very much sign up for that, I think, expecting that it's going to be sort of narcos for credit. So in general, in my research about violence, it's a sort of similar thing. How do you strike a balance between being really frank about that violence without it overwhelming the causality, and understanding the consequences, right? It just becomes about the violence itself. In terms of doing research for asylum cases, I try to rely really heavily on statistics. I haven't done any gender-based cases. The cases I've been working on are mostly gangs and cartels. And so just really thinking about what a judge needs to know in terms of rates of criminal impunity, murder rates, how that changes over time, the likelihood that someone can receive protection from the state. So I would say in that case, I guess maybe I'm a little more willing to let the violence be sensationalized if it's going to help someone not have to go back and face it. But I don't know that that is the right thing. And I think what you're identifying is really important. It's certainly something that I have thought about. I don't know that I have successfully come up with any sort of solution to that issue, because, it's a very tricky balance. It just, in teaching about what's happening in Mexico right now, and talking about it really with anyone. I do a lot of public speaking about this stuff too when I get the opportunity. I think it's really important for people in the US to be confronted with the reality of drug-related violence. But again, what I don't want to ever do is have people walk away with the impression that Mexico is an inherently violent place. And I don't know how we achieve that. I would love to hear other people's suggestions.
I would too. Yeah, Pamela.
I think it's interesting.
sorry.
I'm sorry, Pamela, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I just, my forthcoming book deals with, kind of reads a series of liberal and conservative battles, the Reforma in Mexico, the Civil War in the 1920s in El Salvador, Guatemala, the rest of Central America, as religious wars. And so there's a tendency, of course, to, to cast religious actors and people with religious passion as kind of stalking alter ego to Enlightenment rationality. And so and make it seem like, look, in Latin America, they're still fighting the wars of religion 3 centuries later, kind of thing. And so it's always this like matter of framing, of, you know, pointing out the kind of underlying assumptions that would cast religion as irrational, noting how important it becomes to ideas of civilization versus barbarism, certain forms of religiosity in the 19th century after the fall of the, you know, more formal caste system. But I agree, it's a really tricky thing, because you're pushing up against people's assumption that religion and enlightenment are opposites. And I don't know that I have an answer. I just think that it's always that constant conditioning, and also the sort of, you know, always stressing that it's different but not worse. You know, I feel you, Sarah, when you're teaching on Alonso's book about, you know, the importance of gender and ethnicity to land struggles, that people want to fall back on this kind of, you know, hyper sexualized Mexican masculinity, you know, traffic and those kinds of stereotypes and stuff. So I think it's always good to contextualize it, you know, against US notions of masculinity at the same time period, or, yeah.
I think that's a great question to bring up, Jolie. And I sort of echo Sarah. And first of all, any opportunity any of us have to get on our hind legs and say, there is a civil war in Mexico. Mexico is not hardwired, culturally violent. Machismo is a racist construct. As you say, Pamela, have you seen what the rest of us do in various points of history? Any chance to get on our hind legs and say that, almost no matter what we study, is a good thing. There's no way I'm going to write about contemporary violence as though I were a specialist, because I'm not. And so that step of commenting on this sort of undeclared civil war, there's a lot of people who are kind of better placed to do it than I am. And so I'll sort of leave that to them. But third, and this really interests me, the question of asylum trials and numbers, Sarah, I think are excellent, because there are a few bits of data, which first of all, I think it'd be really useful if we knew, and I'm relatively new to this, but it seems to me that just mapping who is actually doing this and what is the particular line would be quite useful, because maybe I'm a provincial Brit, but actually I just recently found out that a lot of people, like for example, Ev Mead, producing these state-by-state guides, probably you guys all know that. I didn't. It would have been useful too. Some sort of central clearinghouse where we pull this knowledge would be good. And then there's some numbers which we don't have, which could drive really useful research. And what I'm thinking about right now, there's a case underway where a single mother, 4 children, she's facing deportation. And the argument that's being made in the appeal is that she was threatened and left Michoacan under death threat, where her family ran a trucking company. So you can see this, you can make the story. She's a trucker, she's from Michoacan, and she's in a country with a TFR of 2.1 people. Put aside your preconceptions, single mothers with 4 kids in trail are actually going to be pretty visible. Making a case for all of this, though, if you just had numbers and specific body of cases where you say, well, actually, look, victim X was actually tracked by perpetrator Y across about 15 state lines inside Mexico and then killed. And so your case that these generically economic migrants are not asylum seekers who have to prove that they are actually under threat of death if they go back. This one number, how many people have actually been tracked across state lines and killed, of whom we know about? This would actually give any of us who want to show up and make this argument a really useful data point. And so I think that there's actually space to sort of come up with a shopping list. And as I say, I'm a provincial Brit who doesn't know much about this, but there are a series of numbers I'd quite like to have, and a series of cases I'd quite like to have. And having that sort of put out there and people come up with suggestions, data, etc., you know, might be a useful thing.
I mean, LASA did establish a few years ago the expert witness section, which I have found to be super helpful in terms of sharing resources and things like that. I hear you, Paul. I have not, I mean, maybe other people had different experiences. Every single asylum case I've done, the lawyer has very specific things they want me to provide, and it is a narrative of like Mexican machismo. And so I can say like it's a racist construct, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't help their clients, and they're not interested in hearing it. They just don't, you know. And so there's a really interesting question about what work we could do. And maybe these are just two separate projects, like the project where the Hand project and challenging all of these narratives, and the like critique of the strategic essentialism that ultimately goes into those asylum cases. But if we're going to get people asylum, apparently that's the game we have to play. And it's pretty stomach. I don't know if other people are doing these cases. It's pretty stomach churning. And yeah. Anyway, just that.
This is the exact conversation that was happening at the panel I was at before this with the folks from Sarah's conference, right? Which is how is it that when we're, you know, in cases about women, we are creating this image, and then we have to write briefs about men, which is essentially, you know, we've just constructed this whole narrative, and then we have to argue the opposite thing in front of the same judge, right? So
yeah. And we have, I mean, in terms of like, there actually is, Mexico has pretty good domestic violence data. They actually have better domestic violence data than we have for the United States. So they're, and of like for intimate partner violence and other forms of gender violence. I mean, putting aside like the problematic question of how we think about feminicidio, still there's a lot of attention there. So there's a lot of stuff you can work with, but it does continue to reinscribe exactly the kind of narrative that Sarah was warning us about. And anyway, it's just whatever, a personal struggle or whatever.
Well, in an ideal world, your interlocutors would discriminate between sort of SGBV statistics and the sort of broad and really disturbing stories of machismo, etc. Divorcing culture from violence, but of course.
Well, or in an ideal world, the economic asylum would not be a separate, like you would be able to say like, yes, I'm moving to the United States because I can make a better living there. And that would be a totally legit thing to do, as it is for most of us, right? Yeah. I mean, anyway. I know we have a few minutes left. Are there other questions or thoughts for the panelists, for each other?
I would love to hear what Paul is working on next.
Yeah, Paul.
Okay. Well, the sort of right, two answers. And one is I'm really interested in, I'd like to look at communications over a really large chunk of time, because I just keep bumping into muleteers. They're everywhere. I just can't. And if you told me when I was 21 that muleteers were a source of enduring fascination, I would have been very worried about my future self. And I am. But half the revolutionaries are muleteers. They are the sinews of the economy until railroads. It's Latin America wide. People like Vicente Guerrero are muleteers. It's racial mobility, it's social mobility. There's so many stories. It's even biotech. Mules are, it turns out, not just very difficult to breed, but very difficult to age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the sort of respectable sounding, slightly quirky. What I'm actually trying to write is a book, working title, Mexico since 1511, which is sort of modestly, I just want to write the sort of quirky history I'd like to read. It's not a textbook. It's not particularly narrative. I'm interested in things like proselytizing through religious dramas in Nahuatl, and how you have the stage effects of cannonballs filled with fake blood. And yeah, I want to tell people stories about the bits which I think are salient in Mexico over a rather large chunk of time, and then hope that people buy it at airports.
Selfishly, I was hoping that you were going to say you're just going to write the definitive history of the pre.
Well, I think that you should probably, I don't know, no, that ain't going to happen, but thank you anyway for the request.
Maybe you could write something that's a history of AMLO and how we got in this mess.
Wow. It sounded like you had the Echeverria years kind of staked out there, Paul. I was hoping for that.
No, not at all. No, I think that the 60s were kind of my sell-by date, and I look forward to somebody else dealing with Echeverria. And also, I mean, you guys are talking about demonstrating outside the US Embassy.
It's true.
When you have applicants coming saying, I really want to work on Chiapas, and I was born in 1996. I think probably for all of us, these are depressing moments. And so yeah.
Well, not to mention all of our students who now were born after 9/11.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, anyway.
Sarah, what are you working on now? Do we have time? I'm just curious.
Yeah, of course.
Sarah?
I'm writing a book. I sort of skipped Echeverria. Sorry, Paul. I'm looking more at Lopez Portillo, actually. I'm skipping, for me, numerous decades ahead from my work on the 20s. And I'm writing a book about Mexican solidarity with Central American revolutions in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, very cool.
Oh, super cool. I should put you in touch with my student. I don't know if this is of interest to you. She works on Sandinista feminism and like the solidarity movements with, I mean, she started out with a project on the way that Sandinistas police sex work. But she's kind of moved into this stuff about solidarity movements, centered mostly in Nicaragua, but I think she's finding a lot more about these kind of regional solidarity movements. So it would be great to like have the two of you.
I would love to talk to her.
Also,
there are a lot of people working on different dimensions of Central American solidarity. There are a lot of people in Europe working on this right now.
Yeah.
And
Emily Hobson's book is great.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah.
I have it right here, actually. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. And actually the current section of the project that I'm working on is on the radical gay left in Mexico and their solidarity with Central America.
Oh, cool.
Oh, fantastic. Wow.
Yeah, that's excellent. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Last, I don't know. Thank you so much. And also we had, I don't know if you all could see it, we had a few participants coming and going. I think there's some people on Facebook. So also shout out to the attendees who are only there as little like initials to me, but I believe them to be not bots. And I think in particular, I mean, my personal thanks to Steve and in absentia Paula for just being so fabulous. But then also to Pamela and Sarah for being willing, and what's just a really bananas time of year to come in and do this. And I think it's one of the things I love about our field is that there's a lot of, speaking of solidarity, like this eagerness to support one another, which I really love. And good luck to all of you in finishing out what is yet another crazy semester. Hopefully next year there will not be another variant. And enjoy the rest of LASA.
Thank you so
much.